fast forward to more recent times, and the challenges have been around business model and user adoption and scalability. And the challenges have generally followed some chronology of an asset life cycle. So the industry first had to get good at selling, and then the industry had to improve the installation, efficacy, and quality, and then shift focus to financing and ultimately to the operations and optimizing the operation of the asset. So it feels like the industry has kind of evolved over time as the asset base has grown and has matured to solve these problems as they present themselves.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Future of Sustainability in Commercial Real Estate. I'm your host, Sean Swentek. I'm here today with Dave Kenny, COO and co-founder of Omnidian. Welcome, Dave. Thanks for being on the show.
Sean, it's good to be here.
Dave, what inspired the creation of Omnidian? What specific gaps in the market were you trying to address?
Omnidian got off the ground initially based on an observation that the folks who own distributed energy assets are typically missing some key ingredient that allows them to manage and optimize the performance of those assets. So it could be time, data, motivation, but there's typically something that precludes that asset owner from really extracting as much value as possible from their investment, which if you step back and look at it is pretty important, right? That's a big missing gap in the industry because these distributed energy assets are expensive. There's a lot of capital that goes into them. They generate a lot of commodity value, typically in the form of displaced energy that the site host doesn't need to purchase from their utility any longer. And the unfortunate reality is that they sometimes break. So when they break, there's an opportunity to jump in quickly, find that, resolve it, address it. And we found, going back over 8 years now in the industry, that folks were just, again, typically not set up for success there. And that opened up an opportunity for a more focused and dedicated business model around that.
You've been in the industry a long time. What challenges did early solar pioneers like you face in building a viable industry, and how have those challenges shaped where we are today?
I have been in the industry for a while, but the industry certainly predates me. So the word early is kind of an interesting qualifier. You could go back decades in the space and look at the technology challenges that the early pioneers had to tackle. Fast forward to more recent times, and the challenges have been around business model and user adoption and scalability. And the challenges have generally followed some chronology of an asset life cycle. So the industry first had to get good at selling, and then the industry had to improve the installation, efficacy, and quality, and then shift focus to financing and ultimately to the operations and optimizing the operation of the asset. So it feels like the industry has kind of evolved over time as the asset base has grown and has matured to solve these problems as they present themselves.
Looking back, what are some of those key milestones that were transformative for the industry?
Well, one of the big ones, this is kind of a slow ball because it pertains to our business and how we slot in. But one of the big ones certainly was the application of the third-party ownership model through initially the PPA, the power purchase agreement, which was at the time a novel or creative solution to project finance that leveraged larger infrastructure project finance, typically used in like bridges and stuff, and brought that all the way down to smaller scale systems, initially in the commercial space, and then ultimately getting into the residential space now 10 years ago. But that served to open up the market and allow folks who didn't have the capital required to participate in the space and take advantage of the value proposition, no money down up front, and reduce your utility bill on an ongoing basis. And that really kickstarted a wave of growth in the US market that we still see going today.
You talked about third-party ownership. That's one method of financing. Are you seeing a greater market share there on either residential or commercial side versus like cash and loan, or how are you seeing that mix today?
Yeah, it's certainly a dynamic mix. We think of it as a pendulum that swings back and forth. That pendulum had been drifting towards third-party ownership in a pretty significant way, and then got pulled back to loan. I'm speaking now in the residential space, as specialty finance offerings got out into the space, and then more recently, that pendulum has shifted back towards third-party ownership. So we think that'll go back and forth, and there are certain macro level drivers behind that, including macroeconomic drivers like cost of capital, that would influence it. But as we've seen that pendulum shift back and forth, the basic tenet that the asset owner still requires some form of support in optimizing the performance of the asset has held true.
What's your proudest moment in Omnidian's history?
Oh, geez. There have been a lot. Omnidian recently celebrated its 8th year anniversary of being in business. And along that journey, we've had a lot of milestones, everything from, our first all hands outing, which featured, 10, 11, maybe 12 people and a box of pizza on a sailboat in Elliott Bay up in the Pacific Northwest. That's a fond memory. All the way to our most recent all hands, where we had a full event space in downtown Seattle and brought in a scissor lift to help teams drop eggs from the heights of the ceiling, which was also a fond memory. But that kind of bookends the development of the team, right? Which is, in retrospect, kind of the most energizing part of the journey is pulling together a group of folks that just care deeply about what we're doing here.
Despite external pressures, the solar industry just continues to grow year over year. What do you think drives that resilience?
I don't know if it's growth despite of or growth in part fueled by. Part of the challenge, part of the ambiguity in the energy space more generally is just back to retail electric prices that fluctuate. Those fluctuations create, in part, a demand for solar in particular as a way for consumers to take some control over their energy consumption, and most importantly, the costs around that.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen that almost turn into more of a driver for the industry as it relates to regulatory change. That has played out at both the national or federal level, and then down at the state level as well. Our industry has benefited from a layer of support at the federal level and at the state level. The federal level support, of course, comes in the form of the ITC, the investment tax credit, which we've seen change over time and go through periods of threat where it might be pulled or reduced. And at the state level, we've seen those state level mechanisms change and evolve over time. And in the case of California, get phased out over time. Ultimately, we view that as a positive, though, in that it allows the industry to follow some learning curve on price reduction and get to a point where it becomes more self-sufficient over time. So I think if you step back and look at that evolution over the span of a decade, you can kind of see how those policy mechanisms have achieved their goal of building a more robust and resilient industry.
In this post-presidential election stage, if you put on your prognosticator's hat, do you have any thoughts about what might change in the industry? You mentioned incentives. Do you think that will stick around, or?
I wish I had a prognosticator hat. If you point me to the link on Amazon, I'll happily buy one and use it. I think the real answer is we don't know. There's a lot of noise around that topic currently. And the noise in and of itself has become kind of the driving challenge, right? Is that uncertainty. I think if you're going to dig into specific policy mechanisms and look at the IRA, for example, which is our current federal legislation that's supporting the space more generally, folks are taking some solace in the fact that that piece of legislation supports both traditionally red and traditionally blue states. So again, a lot of uncertainty out there, but some hope that there may not be huge disruptions.
Which strategies and innovations over the years have helped our industry remain relevant and resilient in the face of regulatory and economic shifts, like you mentioned?
This is easy to say from the perspective of a business model that touches lots of individual state level markets. More difficult for someone who's in a particular market, like an installer. But the fact that those state level policies do exist at the state level means that if a particular state pulls back or makes a shift, the broader national industry continues to find a way to grow as it grows into other states that haven't changed or become more supportive over time. We've seen that play out, right? Like a good case study might be Nevada. Going back, 10 years was growing gangbusters, and then made some changes, and that state essentially wound down to zero overnight, which had a dramatic impact on the folks who are active in that market. But the national space continued to grow.
What are your biggest takeaways when you look at Omnidian customer experiences that you've heard about over the last few years? What's the general take on what customers are saying about working with Omnidian?
It goes back to the fundamentals, back to the basics. Customers of Omnidian's appreciate it when an asset that is within their control has an issue, and Omnidian is in a position to identify that issue before they have awareness of the fact that something's going on and initiate a response to that problem. And perhaps most importantly, keep that customer informed and updated throughout the journey of responding to and fixing that problem. Where all of those ingredients come together, we see a lot of positive feedback from the customer base and a lot of positive testimonials come through.
As solar owners look to ensure their systems perform well for many years, what makes Omnidian unique amongst other service providers?
Good question. As we think about, competitive landscape and the other business models that are out in this space, we think about, the service partners for sure. These are the folks who have trucks and techs and warehouses and have the ability to get on site to actually fix something. Omnidian is positioned as a complementary business model to those folks as our partners to Omnidian. And so being in a position to, as we were talking about earlier, identify, characterize a performance issue and initiate that response and tap into that network of service partners as part of that process has allowed Omnidian to bring to the market a pretty robust and feature-rich product offer that allows an asset owner to really allow a third party to take responsibility for that full life cycle of performance management in a way that we haven't really seen across the industry. And we think that'll persist into the future.
Does anything stand out to you when you look at the rate of adoption over time for solar on the commercial side, business owners and real estate property owners?
Ebbs and flows. We've been talking a little bit about, the specifics of individual states and state level support, but I think the most noteworthy fact is that it's just continued to increase, right? So the question is by what magnitude and in what particular market, but in general, that adoption rate has increased, which I think just speaks to the fundamentals of the asset class and the opportunity of distributed energy to offer value to site hosts and displace the energy that they're purchasing from their utilities. That's not going to change. As we think about import tariffs or the IRA or labor force constrictions, that'll affect the pace, the rate, but the broader fundamentals are going to continue to drive that increase.
How can business owners and real estate asset owners who may be on the fence and are trying to make a business case for sustainability investments in their property, what can they bring to the team to convince them that that's the right thing to do?
There are a couple layers to that conversation and that pitch. I think the most compelling that we've seen play out is just the economics, right? The value proposition of the energy, in this case, the kilowatt hours that are coming off of that system, the retail value of those kilowatt hours versus the installation expense. The fact that that investment opportunity is positioned under the umbrella of sustainability gives it some additional cachet and legs in some conversations. But at the end of the day, it's got to stand on its own two legs and really deliver a value for the investment.
And so I think what you're saying on the first part of that, the economic side, is that generally an investment in a solar asset for a commercial property is cash positive in the long run for them?
Correct. And it depends, obviously, how it's structured and what the financing solution is. In some cases, you have building owners acting as site hosts, leasing out their rooftop to a developer and asset owner. In other cases, you have folks financing a system and consuming the energy that it generates on site. But in all cases, the basic proposition is that the value of the energy that the system is generating offsets that capital investment. So if you can make that math work and optimize the performance of the asset over time, then you've got a good pitch back internally to make that investment.
Where do you see the sustainability industry overall, solar, battery, EV charging going in the next 10 years?
Good question. There's a lot of different buzzwords there, from solar to battery to EV. I think the general trend that we've already seen play out, and it feeds into the portfolio that we're managing today, is the idea that those asset classes can be pulled together into a coherent strategy, and in a lot of cases, co-located at a site. We see folks starting to understand and explore the benefit and the opportunity to pair a battery system alongside an EV installation and start to bid that resource back in ancillary markets with utility services. So I think the general theme is convergence around those asset classes.
What risks to corporations and property owners face by not embracing these sustainability initiatives that are just becoming so prevalent in the market?
Well, the easy one to pitch based on the conversation so far is the exposure to utility price changes into the future. So if you're not taking proactive action now to manage your exposure to utility tariffs into the future, you're just rolling the dice and waiting to see what happens there. The alternative is to take some control over that, bring those expenses in-house, and manage them more directly.
What will define the solar and sustainability industry of the future? Like, how can stakeholders prepare to navigate this evolution that we're in?
We're in that evolution now. I have heard over time folks talk about technology risk and waiting for some future technology evolution. I don't see that being particularly relevant any longer. The type of equipment that is in the market today is sound and has been in the market for some time, and folks know how to finance it, how to install it, how to operate it. So I think we just see a lot of adoption with the current technology out there. It's got a long lifespan. So we see people thinking about repowering at end of life. We're starting to see that come into play. We've done some of that work already.
For an asset owner who's considering trying to build their own team in-house, what should they be considering when they're looking at sort of that build versus buy decision of contracting with someone like Omnidian?
Yeah, so I think the context of the question there is an asset owner, building owner who's getting into solar and building out a portfolio of assets. As we kind of touched on in this conversation, there's some distinct role or opportunity to manage the performance of those assets and help optimize the portfolio performance over time. So if that's true, then you're faced with the decision of whether or not you're going to do that yourself and build out a team of folks who will do that on your behalf, or work with a partner in this space who's really focused on that. There are examples of both for sure. The groups, the entities that build out teams internally typically have pretty large portfolios that allow them to amortize the costs of that team across a big install base. And some of the considerations that come into play are the tech build out, the technology build out to pull together monitoring infrastructure that allows you to see the performance of all of those assets and quickly surface any issues, outliers, and characterize the root cause of those outliers and jump in and take action. And then on the downstream side of that, a capability to initiate a field service response and manage that field service response over time. So there's a lot of ingredients that go into that. There's some complexity underneath the covers there. We see, as a general comment, we see a trend towards folks outsourcing that responsibility to businesses that have built up models to focus on that. Well, there's a lot that goes into it.
As you look to 2025 and beyond, what are the biggest opportunities that you see for the solar industry?
Well, the largest remaining piece of the cost structure in our industry is what we affectionately refer to as CAC, that's customer acquisition cost. And I'm talking about the US industry here. So in the US, a lot of money goes into acquiring customers. In fact, more money goes into acquiring customers than goes into the modules themselves, or even the installation labor to put them up. So the biggest opportunity is to pull this asset class further into the mainstream such that we're creating demand and we're being pulled into project opportunities. We see that that transition has already occurred in Australia, where 35% of homes already have solar on the roof.
Wow.
And installers effectively have no CAC, no customer acquisition cost, because they're getting pulled into those opportunities and consumers are asking for it. So we like to think of Australia as the proverbial postcard from the future that gives us some vision for where our industry is heading. And it'll sure be exciting to arrive there.
What do you think the future of Omnidian looks like?
Well, as we bring down that customer acquisition cost and see the market expand even more, the opportunity for Omnidian is to be in a position to help support that growth and preserve or maintain the value of those capital investments by ensuring that those assets continue to do what they're supposed to do. That's a risk that, if left unattended, will lead to retraction in the space as capital is affected by those risks and sees a return profile that isn't where they wanted it to be. So Omnidian sees both an opportunity and a responsibility to be a part of that solution and help that industry continue to grow.
Last question. If a business owner who recently installed solar got you on the phone, Dave, and said, give me a 5-floor elevator pitch, why Omnidian?
This is a current customer or
No, a prospective
in the sales pipeline?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, we've already touched on it here in the conversation, but the solar asset that individual is going to put up on their roof is expensive, and it's going to generate meaningful value for them. And at some point in time, they're going to have a problem with it. And if no one's proactively managing the performance of that asset, that problem is going to have an outsized effect on the return profile of the investment. So by getting somebody in place who has a mandate to really focus on the performance of the asset and manage it on their behalf, they'll really be preserving their investment.
Well said, Dave. Thank you again for joining me today. Dave Kenny, COO, co-founder of Omnidian. I'm Sean Swentek, your host. Join us next time for another episode of The Future of Sustainability in Commercial Real Estate. Thanks for listening.